It was supposed to be a simple trip. I'd been staying late at the office all week, drowning in paperwork, and finally, Friday had come. My plan was to catch the 10:40 train from Ridgemont Station, the last train of the night, and head straight to my parents' house for the weekend. Just a quiet break out of the city, away from the noise and the endless fluorescent lights. Ridgemont wasn't my usual station. It was tucked on the edge of town, half abandoned, and only used by locals who didn't mind its dim lighting and sketchy vending machines. But it was close to my office, and I figured the 5-minute walk to the platform beat rushing across town to the busier terminals. I got there at 10:20, and it was as desolate as I expected. The platform stretched out under a single overhead light that flickered faintly, buzzing like a dying insect. A half-torn poster advertising some local festival was plastered crookedly on the station's bulletin board. The air was bitterly cold, biting through my coat as I paced back and forth, rubbing my hands together. The digital display above the ticket machine flashed the words, "Next departure, 10:40 p.m." But something felt wrong. The train's arrival time kept flickering, the numbers glitching in and out, jumping from 10:40 p.m. to something strange. 00 midnight. I frowned and glanced down the tracks. They stretched into the darkness, swallowed by the thick fog rolling in from the fields beyond. No sign of any train. No sound of it either. Just silence so heavy it felt unnatural, like the world had been muted. That's when I heard the whistle. It started low and soft, just a faint sound carried on the wind. But it grew louder, sharper, echoing through the empty station. My stomach tightened, and I stepped back from the edge of the platform. There was no train on the schedule after 10:40. No midnight service. And yet, the sound was unmistakable. Then, through the fog, I saw it. A beam of light piercing the dark, followed by the silhouette of the train itself. But it wasn't the sleek, modern commuter train I was expecting. This train looked old, decades old. The kind of train you'd see in black and white photographs from the 1950s, with heavy iron sides and rounded edges. Its wheels screeched against the tracks as it slowed to a halt, sending a shiver up my spine. The train hissed as the doors slid open. A blast of cold air rushed out, carrying with it the smell of damp wood and something faintly metallic. Blood, maybe. I swallowed hard and looked up as the conductor stepped out. He was tall and wiry, his uniform faded but immaculate, like it had been pressed that morning. His face was pale, almost waxy, and his eyes were sunken deep into their sockets, as though he hadn't slept in years. When he spoke, his voice was soft, yet it carried through the still air like a knife. "Final call," he said, looking directly at me. "Are you boarding?" I should have turned and walked away. Every instinct screamed at me to run, to get as far from that train as possible. But I didn't. My legs moved on their own, carrying me forward, and before I knew it, I was stepping inside. The door slammed shut behind me. The interior was worse than I imagined. The lights overhead were dim and flickered sporadically, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to move on their own. The seats were covered in faded red upholstery, stained and threadbare. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of mildew and something faintly sweet, like rotting fruit. I dropped into a seat by the window, my heart pounding. The glass was dirty, smeared with handprints and streaks of grime that made it impossible to see outside. Not that it mattered. The fog outside was so thick now it was like the train was floating in a sea of gray. I was the only passenger in the car, or so I thought. As the train lurched forward, I noticed something sticking out of the seat back pocket in front of me. A laminated card. I reached for it, my fingers trembling slightly. Rules for passengers. Rule 1. Remain seated unless absolutely necessary. Rule 2. If the lights flicker, hold your breath until they stabilize. Rule 3. Do not look out the window after the first stop. Rule 4. If the train stops at Hollow Reach, do not disembark. Rule 5. If someone boards and sits beside you, do not speak to them or look at them. My heart thudded painfully as I read the list. I glanced around the car again, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "Surprise!" But there was no one. Just the creak of the train and the low hum of its wheels on the track. And then the lights flickered. It was only for a moment. But in that split second of darkness, I could have sworn I saw a face. Not inside the car, but outside, pressed against the glass of my window. A pale, gaunt face with hollow eyes, and a mouth stretched into a silent scream. When the lights came back, the window was empty, but the seat across the aisle wasn't. Someone was sitting there now. I hadn't heard them come in. I hadn't seen them move. They were just there. A man in a dark coat, his head bowed low so I couldn't see his face. His hands were clasped tightly in his lap, pale and bony, the knuckles protruding sharply. I looked down at the rules again, my breath catching on one line. Do not speak to them. Do not look at them. I stared straight ahead, my pulse pounding in my ears, and whispered to myself, "Don't look. Don't look. Don't look." The train kept moving, but the air felt heavier now, colder. And from across the aisle, I swear I could hear him breathing. Slow, steady, too close. The air in the train was thick, almost suffocating. I focused on the seat in front of me, trying to calm the frantic beating of my heart. I could still feel him, sitting across the aisle. The slow, deliberate breathing, the faint rustle of fabric as he shifted. My fingers dug into the seat, clutching it like a lifeline. I wasn't going to look. I wasn't going to speak. That's what the rules said, and I wasn't about to break them. But then he moved. It was subtle at first. The soft creak of the seat as he leaned forward, the whisper of his shoes against the floor. I could feel his presence leaning into my space, the weight of his unseen gaze boring into the side of my head. My breath hitched, and I clenched my eyes shut. "Where are you headed?" His voice was low, raspy, and far too close. I froze. My stomach twisted, and my lungs screamed for air, but I didn't dare respond. I didn't even blink. "You're going to ignore me?" he asked, almost amused. "That's rude, you know." The rules screamed in my mind. Don't speak. Don't look. I bit down on the inside of my cheek so hard I tasted blood. The train rattled along the tracks, the rhythm mismatched and disjointed, as though the car itself were coming apart. His voice dropped lower. "You can feel it, can't you? The weight of this place, the way it clings to you." A soft chuckle. "They always think they can ignore it, that they can ride it out, but it always gets them in the end." I squeezed my eyes tighter, desperate to block out the sound. I thought about getting up, running to the next car, but the rules forbade it. And even if I wanted to, my legs felt paralyzed, rooted to the spot by fear. The lights overhead flickered again, bathing the car in darkness for a split second. When they came back, the breathing stopped. The air felt colder, sharper, like the temperature had dropped 20 degrees in an instant. Slowly, cautiously, I opened my eyes. He was gone. The seat across the aisle was empty, and the air where he'd been sitting seemed wrong. Blurred, like heat rising off asphalt, but cold and colorless. I shivered, my breath clouding in front of me, and glanced down at the laminated rules again, desperate for some kind of reassurance. Instead, I noticed something new. Another line, written in red ink, scrawled in jagged letters across the bottom of the card. Rule 10. You can't ignore what's already noticed you. My pulse thundered in my ears as I read the words over and over, my mind scrambling for an explanation. The rules hadn't been like this before. I was sure of it. I wanted to scream, to get off the train, but I didn't know where I was. I didn't even know if I could get off. The intercom crackled to life, its garbled voice breaking the silence. Next stop, Hollow Reach. My stomach dropped. No, we couldn't be stopping again. The train couldn't just keep looping to that same cursed stop. I glanced out the window, forgetting myself for just a moment, and immediately regretted it. There it was, the platform, shrouded in a thick, unnatural mist. Tall, shadowy figures stood along its edges, their forms distorted like reflections in broken glass. They didn't move, but I could feel their attention. All of it. It pressed against the windows, against my chest, smothering me in a way that words couldn't describe. The train slowed. The brakes screamed. The door to the car hissed open, and the mist began to pour in, curling along the floor like living smoke. Something stepped inside. I didn't look directly at it. I couldn't. My eyes stayed glued to the laminated card in my trembling hands, but I could see it in my peripheral vision. A figure, impossibly tall, its head brushing against the ceiling of the car. Its limbs were too long, its joints bending at unnatural angles as it moved slowly down the aisle. The passengers from other cars began spilling into ours. I heard the frantic shuffle of feet behind me and the soft murmurs of people trying desperately not to scream. The air grew denser with each step the figure took, like it was sucking the oxygen out of the car. I bit my lip hard enough to draw blood, the coppery taste grounding me as I struggled to stay still. It stopped just behind me. The mist coiled tighter around my ankles, cold and wet like tendrils of ice. I could hear it breathing now, a low, hollow sound that rattled like wind through an empty cavern. Its presence loomed over me, heavy and suffocating. "You shouldn't be here," it whispered, its voice barely audible but sharp enough to cut through my thoughts. I gritted my teeth, willing myself not to react, not to flinch. It didn't move. It didn't speak again. It just lingered, and then, as quickly as it had come, it was gone. The air lifted, the mist retreated, and the train began to move again. The passengers around me, people I hadn't even realized were there before, began to murmur in hushed voices. None of them made eye contact. None of them acknowledged what had just happened. I looked back at the card in my hand. The red scrawl at the bottom had changed. Rule 11. Hollow Reach is not a place, it's a warning. I stared at the words, my pulse roaring in my ears, and for the first time, I truly understood. This wasn't just a train. It wasn't taking me anywhere. It was taking me apart. The train kept moving, but everything felt wrong. The car was filled now, though I hadn't seen anyone board. They sat silently in their seats, faces downcast, their features unnervingly blurred in the flickering light. Every one of them seemed to avoid meeting my gaze. It was like they knew something I didn't, something that kept their heads bowed and their hands clasped tightly in their laps. I wanted to speak, to ask where they'd come from, but the rules echoed in my head. Do not speak to the other passengers. Do not acknowledge them. I couldn't stay silent forever. Could I? The laminated card was still clutched in my hand, its edges digging into my palm. My eyes flicked back to the fresh warning scrawled across the bottom. Hollow Reach is not a place. It's a warning. The words buzzed in my brain like a swarm of flies. I didn't understand what it meant, but I knew, deep down, that I'd already broken something, some boundary I hadn't even known was there. The car jerked violently, throwing me forward in my seat. A few of the passengers stirred, their movements mechanical, almost rehearsed. A man 3 rows ahead turned his head slightly, just enough for me to catch a glimpse of his face. I froze. His features were incomplete. His eyes were dark hollows, his mouth little more than a shadow smudged across his face. And yet, I could feel him looking at me, seeing me. I turned away quickly, bile rising in my throat, and pressed myself against the window. The glass was ice cold against my cheek, but it was better than facing the void where his face should have been. The train began to slow again. The intercom crackled, but this time, the voice that came through wasn't the calm monotone of before. It was wrong, distorted, layered with something guttural, something inhuman. Next stop, Crystal River. The name sent a jolt of terror through me. It wasn't on the rules card, but I remembered it vividly. Do not look out the window at Crystal River. Do not disembark. I clamped my eyes shut and gripped the armrests, my breathing shallow. Outside, I could hear something. A low hum, faint at first, but it grew louder as the train crawled to a stop. It wasn't a human sound, nor was it mechanical. It was wet and sloshing, like the dragging of something enormous and heavy through water. The passengers around me began to shift uneasily. I risked a glance and saw their faces, or what was left of them. The hollowness was spreading. Eyes that had once been normal were now black pits, mouths reduced to twisted slashes. They seemed to sway in unison, as if drawn by some invisible force. Some of them turned toward the windows. "Don't look," I whispered to myself. My voice barely made it past my lips. "Don't." But then the woman next to me stood. I hadn't even noticed her until that moment. Her movements were stiff, her head tilting at an unnatural angle as she rose from her seat. She turned toward me, and my heart stopped. Her face wasn't hers anymore. Her skin was too tight, stretched like plastic over her skull. Her eyes were completely black, and when she opened her mouth, it wasn't a scream that came out. It was the hum, that awful wet hum. She raised one hand, her fingers twitching like broken clockwork, and pointed toward the window. "Look," she said. The train shook violently, the lights flickering so fast it made the shadows look alive. I shut my eyes tight, my hands flying up to cover my ears, but it didn't help. The hum was inside my head now, reverberating in my skull like the toll of a massive bell. My pulse roared in my ears, drowning out my thoughts. All I could do was curl into myself, repeating the same words over and over. "Don't look. Don't look. Don't look." The train jolted forward suddenly, nearly knocking me out of my seat. The hum stopped. The air shifted, the cold lifting slightly, and when I opened my eyes, the woman was gone. The seat next to me was empty, as though she'd never been there at all. The intercom buzzed again, its tone soft and even, as if nothing had happened. "Next stop, Ridgeview Crossing." I let out a shaky breath, my heart hammering against my ribs. The laminated card sat on my lap, and I forced myself to look at it again. Another line had been added at the bottom, written in the same jagged red scrawl. "Rule 12. If you've made it this far, you're already theirs." I swallowed hard, the words blurring as tears welled up in my eyes. What does that mean? I wanted to scream. Who were they? What did they want? I glanced around the car, hoping for some kind of answer, but the other passengers were as still and silent as before, except for one. A man stood at the far end of the car, his figure shrouded in shadow. He was tall, his arms unnaturally long, his head tilted at an odd angle. Even from a distance, I could feel his gaze locking onto me, and then he started walking toward me. The man, or whatever it was, moved slowly at first, each step deliberate, the sound of his shoes impossibly loud against the train's metal floor. Tap, tap, tap. Every step felt like a countdown, pulling the walls of the car closer around me. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. My fingers dug into the seat, and my legs felt like they were bolted in place. I wanted to look away, but his presence commanded my attention. His silhouette was wrong, too tall, his limbs too long, his movements too smooth, like he was gliding more than walking. The passengers around me didn't react. They sat frozen, their heads bowed, as though they hadn't noticed him. Or maybe they refused to notice him. "Please," I whispered under my breath, though I didn't know who I was begging. The man kept coming. His face was still hidden in shadow, but as he drew closer, I began to make out details. The long, tattered coat he wore, the way his arms hung unnaturally low at his sides, his hands. God, his hands. The fingers were impossibly long, knotted like old branches, and the skin stretched so tightly it was translucent. Black veins pulsed beneath the surface, writhing as though they were alive. Do not speak to them. Do not acknowledge them. The rule echoed in my mind like a mantra. I gritted my teeth, staring straight ahead, but I could feel him closing the distance. My skin prickled as he drew closer, the air around me growing colder with every step. The mist was back, curling around my ankles like searching fingers. He stopped. I don't know how I knew he was standing beside me. I didn't look, but I could feel him there. The weight of his presence was crushing, suffocating, as though the air had been replaced with lead. The cold seeped into my bones, and I had to fight the urge to shiver. For a moment, everything was silent. The train, the passengers, even the sound of my own breath. All of it stopped. The only thing I could hear was the faint rustling of his coat, the creak of his joints as he leaned in closer. "Why are you here?" His voice was deep and hollow, more of a vibration than a sound, and it rattled in my chest like an earthquake. I didn't answer. I didn't dare. "I asked you a question," he said, his tone sharper now. His breath was icy against my ear, carrying the faint stench of decay. "Why are you here?" My lips trembled, but I clenched my teeth, willing myself to stay silent. He let out a low, guttural sound, something between a growl and a laugh. I felt his shadow shift, moving closer, his head now hovering just over mine. "You can't ignore me," he hissed. "No one does." I squeezed my eyes shut, the weight of him pressing down on me, and whispered the words I'd been clinging to since I boarded the train. "Don't look. Don't speak. Don't move." For a moment, it felt like the car itself was holding its breath. And then, mercifully, he moved on. The pressure lifted, and I opened my eyes, my vision swimming with tears I hadn't realized I was holding back. I risked a glance behind me, and my stomach dropped. He hadn't left the car. He was still there, now standing at the far end again, his figure partially obscured by the mist. But he wasn't alone anymore. The passengers, the ones who had been silent and still, were rising from their seats. One by one, they stood, their movements stiff and unnatural, their heads turning in jerky mechanical motions. Their faces, if you could even call them that, were blank and featureless now. The hollows where their eyes and mouths should have been impossibly dark. And they were all looking at me. I scrambled out of my seat, panic clawing at my throat. My legs felt heavy, like they didn't belong to me anymore, but I forced them to move. The door at the far end of the car loomed ahead, and I stumbled toward it, my breath coming in ragged gasps. Behind me, the sound of footsteps filled the air. Slow, shuffling, relentless. They were following me, following. I reached the door and slammed my hand against the release lever. It didn't budge. My heart raced as I pulled harder, the metal biting into my palm, but it was useless. The door wasn't locked. It was something worse than that. It simply wasn't meant to open. The footsteps grew louder, closer, and I turned to see them. All of them. The passengers were only feet away now, their hollow faces tilted in my direction, their bodies moving in perfect unison. The man in the tattered coat stood in the middle of them, his arms outstretched like a conductor leading an orchestra. "You can't run," he said, his voice carrying through the car like a storm. "You're part of this now." I pressed my back against the door, my chest heaving as they advanced. The laminated card was still clutched in my hand, and I glanced down at it, desperate for answers. The red scrawl had changed again, new words etched across the bottom. Rule 13. The doors won't open until they let you go. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "No, no, no." The man's grin widened, his teeth sharp and black as coal. "It's time," he said. And then the lights went out. The lights didn't just go out, they vanished. The car was plunged into an oppressive darkness so complete it felt like I'd been buried alive. Even the faint hum of the train's engine seemed to fade, leaving me in a suffocating void. And then I heard them, the footsteps. Not slow this time, fast, eager, scraping against the floor like claws raking metal. I couldn't see them, but I knew they were closing in. My chest felt like it was about to burst, every breath a shallow gasp that barely filled my lungs. My fingers scrambled against the sealed door, but it was useless. I was trapped, and I wasn't alone. A sound, wet and unnatural, rose above the footsteps. It was a squelching noise, like something heavy dragging itself across a damp floor. My stomach churned, and my instincts screamed for me to move. I stumbled blindly along the edge of the car, my hands outstretched, desperate to find something, anything, that would lead me away from them. But the air around me shifted. It grew heavier, colder, like the darkness itself was alive. I could feel it pressing against my skin, wrapping around me like invisible hands. And then, just ahead, I saw it. A faint glow. A pale, sickly light cutting through the black. It wasn't comforting. It wasn't safe. But it was the only thing I could see. I moved toward it, my legs trembling with every step. The glow came from the seat I had abandoned, and as I got closer, I realized what it was. The laminated card. It was glowing, the red scrawl now burning like fire across its surface. Rule 14. Stay in the light. I grabbed the card, clutching it to my chest like a lifeline. The glow dimmed slightly, but it was enough to illuminate a few feet around me, enough to see them. The passengers were no longer human, not even close. Their bodies were distorted, stretched into impossible shapes, their limbs too long, their spines arched at grotesque angles. Their faces, if you could call the gaping voids in their heads faces, twisted toward me as they moved closer. The air was thick with the sound of their movements, a wet, slithering cacophony that made my skin crawl. And at the center of it all was him. The man in the tattered coat stood still, his hollow eyes locked onto me. He didn't move, but his presence was suffocating, like a storm waiting to break. His grin was wider now, impossibly so, stretching across his face like a wound. "You think you can run?" he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to echo from everywhere at once. "This isn't a train, little one. It's a tunnel." I shook my head, clutching the glowing card tighter. "What do you want from me?" My voice cracked, barely audible over the pounding of my heart. He tilted his head, his grin faltering slightly. "Want? No. This isn't about want. This is about taking. The shadows surged forward, the passengers lurching closer. I stumbled back, the dim glow of the card barely keeping them at bay. My back hit the far wall, and I realized with dawning horror that I was cornered. "Stay in the light," I whispered to myself, repeating the rule over and over like a prayer. The man's hollow eyes narrowed. "Light won't save you. Not here. Not from us." The card in my hand flickered, its glow fading. Panic clawed at my throat as the darkness pressed closer, the shapes of the passengers twisting and writhing like living shadows. I could feel the cold emanating from them, sharp and biting, and I knew, if they touched me, it would be over. And then the card changed again. The red scrawl shifted, the letters writhing across the surface like living things. Rule 15. The emergency brake is the only escape. I didn't wait to think. I didn't hesitate. I bolted, darting through the narrow space the dim light provided, weaving between the passengers as they lunged for me. Their fingers, long, skeletal things, brushed against my shoulders, my arms, but I didn't stop. I couldn't. The emergency brake was at the far end of the car, past the shadowed figure of the man. His grin twisted into something monstrous as I approached, his body seeming to stretch and grow, filling the space around him. His voice boomed, shaking the walls of the car. "You cannot leave!" But I didn't stop. I ducked under his outstretched arm, the air around him freezing and thick, and slammed my hand against the red lever of the emergency brake. The train screamed. The sound was deafening, a metallic wail that rattled my teeth and made my head feel like it was splitting in two. The car jolted violently, throwing me to the floor, and I felt the air shift again, the darkness pulling back, retreating like a wave. And then, silence. When I opened my eyes, the train was still. The lights were on, flickering weakly but steady enough to reveal the empty car. The passengers were gone. The man in the tattered coat was nowhere to be seen. I was alone. The laminated card lay on the floor beside me, its edges singed and curling as if it had been burned. The words had disappeared, leaving behind only blank plastic. I stared at it for a long moment, my chest heaving, before I rose to my feet. The door at the end of the car was open now, leading to the next one. Beyond it, I could see faint sunlight streaming in through cracked windows. The world outside was still shrouded in fog, but it felt lighter, almost normal. I didn't trust it, but I didn't have a choice. I stepped through the door, leaving the car behind. And as I walked, I couldn't help but feel like something was still watching me, waiting, because trains only take you where you're meant to go. And I wasn't sure if I'd made it out, or if the journey had just begun. I stepped through the open door, each step heavy, my legs trembling beneath me. The sunlight ahead, weak and filtered through layers of fog, looked almost inviting. Almost. But as soon as I crossed the threshold into the next car, the door slammed shut behind me with a metallic thud that echoed like a gunshot. I spun around, heart pounding. The door was sealed again, its surface smooth and featureless as though it had never opened at all. There was no way back. The new car was eerily different from the one I'd just left. For one, it was pristine. Clean seats, polished floors, bright, even lighting. It felt wrong. Too clean, too bright, like a hospital room trying too hard to be welcoming. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic, sharp and artificial, and the faint buzz of fluorescent lights filled the silence. The laminated card was gone now, left behind in the previous car. My hands felt naked without it, like I'd lost the only thing keeping me tethered to reality. I stood there, frozen, unsure whether to move forward or stay put. "Please take your seat," a calm, feminine voice announced over the intercom. I flinched, my eyes darting toward the ceiling. The voice wasn't distorted or menacing like before. It was smooth, almost comforting, but that only made it worse. It was the kind of voice designed to lull you into a false sense of security. "Take your seat," it repeated. This time, there was an edge to it, a subtle warning beneath the politeness. I scanned the car, hesitant. There were no other passengers here, no shadowed figures or grotesque shapes, just rows of empty, spotless seats. I chose the nearest one, sliding into it cautiously. The fabric was cool and firm, untouched by time or wear. For a moment, I let out a shaky breath. Maybe this car was safe. That's when I noticed the windows. They weren't windows at all. The glass was perfectly clear, but there was nothing outside. No fog, no tracks, no world. Just a vast, infinite blackness. My stomach twisted. I looked away quickly, focusing on the seat back in front of me. A sound broke the silence. A soft creak, like someone shifting their weight. My head snapped up, and my breath caught in my throat. A figure sat 3 rows ahead of me. I hadn't seen them before, hadn't heard them enter. They were slumped forward slightly, their head tilted at an odd angle, as though they'd fallen asleep in their seat. Their hair was long and dark, falling over their face like a curtain. Their hands rested limply in their lap, pale and motionless. I stared at them, my pulse quickening. The intercom voice echoed in my head. "Take your seat." The figure didn't move. I told myself to stay calm. Maybe they were just another passenger. Maybe they'd been here all along, and I hadn't noticed. But the air felt wrong again, heavy and electric, like the atmosphere before a storm. And as I sat there, watching them, I realized something chilling. Their chest wasn't rising. They weren't breathing. The train began to move again, the sudden lurch nearly knocking me from my seat. I clutched the armrests, my eyes flicking between the figure and the windows. The blackness outside swirled now, shifting like smoke. Shapes moved within it, indistinct and writhing, and I squeezed my eyes shut. When I opened them, the figure was no longer sitting. They were standing. I bit back a scream, my body stiffening as I watched them. They stood in the aisle now, their heads still tilted, their face still obscured by hair. They weren't looking at me, not yet, but their body was angled toward mine, one arm twitching slightly at their side. "Stay seated," the intercom instructed, the voice more insistent this time. I didn't move. I couldn't. My hands gripped the armrests so tightly I thought the plastic might crack beneath my fingers. The figure tilted their head further, the motion slow and unnatural, as though their neck were made of rubber. Then they began to walk. Step by step, they moved down the aisle, their bare feet slapping softly against the floor. They didn't hurry. They didn't make a sound other than those soft, wet footsteps. I tried to focus on my breathing, to remind myself of the rules, even if I didn't have the card anymore. Stay seated. Don't acknowledge them. Don't speak. But they were getting closer. I glanced at the windows again, hoping for any sign of the outside world. There was nothing but blackness. The shapes within it pressed closer, their indistinct forms writhing just beyond the glass. For a brief, horrifying moment, I wondered if they could break through, if they were even outside at all. The figure stopped beside me. My whole body went rigid as their presence loomed over me. I could hear their breathing now, slow and labored, like air moving through broken pipes. The smell hit me next, sharp and cloying, a mix of rot and iron. I kept my gaze fixed on the seat in front of me, every muscle screaming to run, to get away. "You shouldn't be here," they rasped. I didn't respond. My lips pressed into a tight line, my jaw clenched so hard it hurt. "You don't belong here," they said again, their voice closer now, like it was right by my ear. The urge to look was overwhelming. I could feel them leaning toward me, their breath hot and wet against my skin. My hands trembled against the armrests, my nails digging into the fabric. The train lurched again, harder this time, and I risked a glance. Just one. Their face was inches from mine. No, not a face. The thing in front of me didn't have a face. It was a void, a chasm of nothingness where features should have been. And in that emptiness, I saw something moving, something alive. 1,000 tiny, writhing shapes, like worms squirming in the dark. I screamed, and just like that, the lights flickered. When they came back, the figure was gone. So was the blackness outside. The train was still moving, but through the windows, I could see something new. A station, dim and flickering, was slowly coming into view. The intercom buzzed one final time. Next stop, Terminus. The station grew closer, its dim lights flickering like dying embers. Through the windows, I could make out a skeletal framework of rusted beams and cracked concrete. The platform was long, stretching into the fog like it had no end. The word Terminus was scrawled across a weathered sign, its letters faded and chipped, barely legible. The train began to slow. The brakes screeched in protest, a high-pitched wail that rattled my teeth and made my chest ache. I didn't want to leave the car, but I knew I didn't have a choice. Something told me this was the end of the line, whether I wanted it to be or not. The door hissed open, and the air that seeped in was heavy and damp, carrying the faint stench of decay. I rose from my seat, my legs trembling beneath me, and stepped onto the platform. The ground felt uneven, like it was alive, shifting slightly beneath my feet. The mist clung to my skin, cold and wet, as I glanced around. The platform was empty, or at least it seemed that way at first. Shadows lingered at the edges of the light, shapes moving just out of sight. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and I gripped the railing beside me, trying to steady myself. The train behind me groaned, its engine sputtering weakly. I turned to look, and my stomach dropped. The car I had just exited was decaying. The once pristine seats were now torn and rotting, The walls streaked with black mold. The lights inside flickered wildly, revealing glimpses of things. Figures that shouldn't exist, pressed against the windows, their hollow eyes staring out. Before I could react, the train began to pull away, its wheels screeching against the tracks. I reached out instinctively, as if grabbing for it could save me, but it was too late. The train vanished into the fog, leaving me alone on the platform. Or so I thought. A voice broke the silence. Low and rasping, it echoed from somewhere deep within the mist. "You shouldn't have come." I froze. My breath hitched, and I spun around, searching for the source. The shadows along the edges of the platform began to shift, growing taller, darker. Figures emerged from the fog, their forms twisted and unnatural. Their heads were tilted at odd angles, their limbs too long, their movements jerky and uneven. They were the passengers from the train. But they weren't human anymore. They surrounded me, their hollow faces turning toward me in unison. My legs refused to move, my body paralyzed by a cold, creeping fear. One of them stepped closer, its feet dragging against the ground, leaving wet, black streaks in its wake. "You don't belong here," it whispered, its voice a guttural echo that seemed to come from everywhere at once. Another stepped forward, and then another, their movements synchronized, as if they were all part of the same mind. The air grew colder, the mist thickening around me, and I knew I couldn't stay there. If I did, I would become one of them. I bolted. The platform seemed endless, stretching into the fog without end. My footsteps echoed against the concrete, and the sound of their pursuit followed close behind. Their voices melded into a single deafening chant. "You shouldn't have come. You shouldn't have come." I ran until my lungs burned, until my legs felt like they would give out. The fog ahead began to thin, revealing a staircase that descended into darkness. I hesitated for only a moment before plunging down, the cold metal steps clanging beneath my feet. The chanting grew fainter as I descended, the mist above swallowing their figures. When I reached the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in a tunnel. The walls were damp and covered in streaks of rust, the air thick with the stench of stagnant water. A faint light flickered in the distance, drawing me forward. I didn't want to go toward it, but what choice did I have? The light grew brighter as I approached, revealing a door set into the wall of the tunnel. It was old, its surface corroded and streaked with black, but it was slightly ajar. I pushed it open and stepped inside. The room beyond was small, cramped, and suffocating. A single bulb hung from the ceiling, its light swinging wildly, casting long, shifting shadows. In the center of the room stood a desk, and behind the desk sat a man, or at least what looked like a man. His skin was pale, stretched too tightly over his bones, and his eyes were dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. He wore a conductor's uniform, the same kind I'd seen when I first boarded the train. But his smile, it was too wide, too sharp, as though it had been carved into his face. "You've made it far," he said, his voice smooth and cold. "Few do." I didn't respond. My mouth was dry, my throat tight, and all I could do was stare. He gestured to the chair in front of the desk. "Sit." My legs moved on their own, my body obeying him before my mind could protest. The chair was cold and hard, and I gripped its edges to stop my hands from trembling. "You want answers," the man said, leaning forward. His grin widened. "But answers come at a cost." I swallowed hard, my voice barely above a whisper. "What is this place?" He chuckled, the sound low and hollow. "This is where it ends. For you, for them, for everyone who boards that train. Terminus is the last stop, the place where the living and the dead meet." My chest tightened. Am I dead? His grin faltered just for a moment. Not yet. The room seemed to close in around me, the air growing heavier. Then why am I here? Why did the train bring me? "You chose this," he said simply. "You stepped aboard. You ignored the warnings. And now, you belong to them." I shook my head, my voice trembling. "I didn't know. I didn't." He slammed his hand on the desk, and the light above flickered violently. "It doesn't matter what you knew. It only matters that you're here." The shadows along the walls began to move, shifting and writhing, their shapes stretching toward me. The air grew colder, the stench of decay filling my lungs. I tried to stand, to run, but my body wouldn't move. "There's only one way out," the man said, his grin returning. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small rusted key. "The door at the end of the tunnel. If you can reach it, you might make it back." He placed the key on the desk and slid it toward me. "But be warned," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "The things in the dark don't like it when you try to leave." My fingers closed around the key, and the shadows surged forward. I grabbed the rusted key and bolted from the room, the conductor's cold laughter echoing behind me. The tunnel ahead stretched endlessly, walls dripping with water, and the stench of decay. The faint light I'd seen before seemed farther away now, flickering like a dying flame. Behind me, the passengers stirred. Their chant started softly, growing louder with each step. "You shouldn't have come. You can't leave." I forced myself to keep running. The key felt heavy in my hand, pulsing faintly, as if it were alive. The tunnel seemed to shift as I ran, the walls tightening, the air growing colder. The chant swelled, their footsteps slapping wetly against the floor. When I glanced back, my blood ran cold. They were no longer human, twisted limbs and hollow faces, their movements jerky and inhuman. Leading them was him. The man in the tattered coat towered above the rest, his face blank but radiating fury. He didn't run. He didn't have to. His presence seemed to drag the others forward. The light ahead brightened suddenly, revealing the door. Massive, ancient, carved with shifting symbols. My pulse quickened, hope sparking in my chest. I pushed harder, ignoring the burn in my lungs, ignoring the cold breath of the things behind me. I stumbled as I reached the door, the ground beneath me no longer solid but soft, fleshy, pulsing. The key slipped from my grasp, skittering across the floor. A passenger's skeletal hand grabbed my ankle, its fingers digging deep into my skin. "You can't leave," it rasped. I kicked, breaking free, and lunged for the key. My hand closed around it just as the shadows swarmed closer, their twisted limbs reaching for me. I jammed the key into the lock, my breath hitching as it turned with a deafening click. The door swung open, and blinding light poured through, cutting through the dark like a blade. The passengers screamed, recoiling, their forms flickering and dissolving in the glow. Even the man in the coat faltered, his hollow face contorted in rage as the light consumed him. "You belong to us," he roared, his voice shaking the walls. "You'll never escape." I stepped through the door, the light swallowing me whole. The final platform. When I opened my eyes, I was back at Ridgemont Station. The platform was empty, the cold air biting against my skin. The train was gone, its tracks stretching into the distance, silent. At my feet lay a single laminated card. I picked it up, my hands trembling. Written in jagged red letters, it read, "You've left the train, but you'll never leave the journey." A faint whistle echoed in the distance. The train would return. It always did.